The Vikings, fierce warriors who swept through the world like a storm over 1,000 years ago, are now the subject of new discoveries that challenge our understanding of them. We often perceive them as barbarians. However, they simply held a worldview vastly different from our own. A recent discovery on a remote island suggests the Vikings invoked supernatural powers in their pursuit of wealth. Though hostile, violent, and destructive evidence now indicates that during a mysterious crisis, they unexpectedly became saviors. Most dramatic of all is the story of a Viking king named Ivar. In 2020, archaeologists uncovered the remains of the harbor where he docked hundreds of ships filled with slaves. Ivar and his descendants forged an empire in the North Atlantic. They also invaded the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, threatening to crush the fledgling nation of England. The dynasty of Ivar ultimately changed the course of history. This is their story. Who were the Vikings? And why did they leave their homes to raid and invade far-off lands? To answer these questions, we must follow the trail back to its source. Many Vikings originated in Norway, specifically in its oldest city, Tonsberg. Vikings founded a trading post here towards the end of the 9th century. Today, the city is home to the Oseberg Viking Heritage Foundation. To understand the importance of the sea sailing and ships to Norwegians, one only has to look at the map, observe the coastline, the fjords, the inlets, and all the islands. Remember that roads are a modern invention. Adhering to a belief system that glorified war, the Vikings may have felt a duty to attack the Christian lands across the sea to the west. However, they also had other motivations. Scandinavian society was a hierarchy, and opportunities for upward mobility were very limited. Going abroad presented possibilities of acquiring resources to climb the social ladder. This could have been one of the reasons for their risk-taking. Thus, they would first travel to gain the loot necessary to establish social status. Possessing tremendously fancy exotic items, or more slaves than a neighbor established one as an important person. Now, another possible reason for the exodus of Vikings has emerged. They faced a powerful and unpredictable force, the climate. Information about past weather conditions has always been limited, but now science unlocks extraordinary insights into climate history. The climate leaves traces that remain in the landscape for centuries, locked in the tree rings of ancient oaks. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, allows scientists to chart weather conditions through the ages. The Old World Drought Atlas is an online resource that examines European tree ring data going back over 1,000 years. The data shows that around 794 AD, a severe drought struck northern Europe. This graphic map displays the worst affected areas, Scandinavia suffered badly as dry year followed dry year. Crops simply would not grow in Western Scandinavia. Resources stretched to breaking point. Desperation drove many to extreme measures. Because of this drought occurring in Scandinavia at the time, they had an incentive to leave looking for alternative resources. Simultaneously, they were finding very rich monasteries from which they could pull portable wealth. They left because there was not much left for them at home. Population pressures in the homeland were causing starvation in some parts of Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th centuries. Scandinavians were world leaders in shipbuilding. Using basic materials like wood and sheep's wool, they fashioned sleek and sophisticated longships. In Tonsberg, modern shipbuilders construct exact replicas of these vessels. The Gokstad ship, of which a replica is being built, is the biggest known Viking ship. It will probably take 5 to 6 years to build, much longer than what the Vikings would have done, because they could employ a lot more manpower. Furthermore, it is more difficult to make an exact replica than the original. Nobody can criticize the original, but on a replica, of course, they can. The team uses the exact same methods, tools, and materials as their Viking forebears. Every plank is shaped by hand, and with hand tools alone. For example, the keel is a tremendous job. They start with an oak log of this diameter and cut it down to the size seen in the yard. It is a tremendous amount of work. When building the Gokstad ship, they are trying to make it as close to the original as possible. That includes using the same kind of tools that the Vikings would have used, and also the same kind of timber for the ship itself. This means, for example, they will not use a saw because the Vikings did not have saws. We can still visit original Viking ships. Archaeologists have unearthed several that the Vikings buried over 1,000 years ago. Some of the most famous are preserved here at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. The design of the Viking ship is quite special. It does not go very deep in the ocean to sail. It rides high in the water, so it was very fast. Because of the keel, it was also possible to go very near the coast. Thus, boat technology was very important. These ships were also perfect for raiding thanks partly to a unique innovation, the side rudder. The Vikings could lift the side rudder out of the water quickly, allowing them to maneuver right up to the shore, a real advantage when launching surprise attacks. For decades, Viking expeditions set sail from Norway, striking west across the North Sea and on towards the rich monasteries of Britain and Ireland. Among them were two proud and ruthless leaders, Olaf the White and the Viking king Ivar. Now, new discovery in Dublin, Ireland, reveals more about Olaf and Ivar. and the international scale of their power and ambition. Hidden in the center of Dublin, the castle gardens are an oasis in the bustling capital. Once, a large pool or lake occupied this site. It was a massive Viking harbor packed with warships and slave ships. Locals called it the Black Pool or Dublin, and this gives Dublin its name. Now archaeologists uncover exciting traces of the birth of a city. In 2020, archaeologists excavated a large site directly beside the castle gardens. The team dug down through the centuries, uncovering material from over 1,000 years of history, and soon they made an important discovery. The archaeologists believe they have unearthed part of Dublin's original Viking harbor. The discovery of Viking ship timber and ship's nails shows they are on the right track. Here, a piece of ship's timber that was found on the site is half of the rib of a Viking boat. The evidence suggests Dublin's Viking harbor was huge, large enough to accommodate 200 ships. But who built it? Could it be the Viking kings who ruled Dublin from around 850 AD? These characters, Olaf and Ivar, burst into the Irish historical scene in the early 850s. They are two leaders who work together. In some sources, they are identified as brothers. They were politically active for over 2 decades in Ireland. The new discoveries at Ship Street show just how extensive the Dublin settlement was under Ivar's rule. This was a major international hub where slaves and other goods were gathered and shipped off to ports around the known world. Through a combination of war trade and settlement, Ivar and his descendants changed Western Europe, helping to create the region we know today. For the Vikings, the project had unprecedented scale and ambition. It was the culmination of a process that started some 60 years earlier in the late 9th century, when Vikings began raiding monasteries around northwest Europe. The Norse at this time in Scandinavia were not practicing Christians. They were following their own religion. So they did not have the same moral obstacles from plundering monasteries, which were rich with silver and gold. These monasteries and churches were largely unprotected, which meant that the Norse were able to come over and pillage them without much opposition. They were easy targets. The church settlement is an easy target. Vikings are not here to lose their lives. Vikings are here to gain the plunder they need to take back as easily and with as little cost on their end as possible. They were businessmen, so they came in 2 or 3 ships after scouting the area. They knew where they were attacking. In 793 AD, Vikings attacked the monastery on Lindisfarne Island off England's northeast coast. The invaders killed those who resisted and made captives of the others. They also carried off the church's precious treasures. Soon others would follow their lead. Vikings did not initially set out to come to Ireland. They gradually came down the Atlantic, really, and they would only have traveled in the summertime. Initially, they engaged in what is called a Viking hunt, searching for prey. They were not out to conquer anywhere. They were just plunderers and raiders. They came down the Scottish islands, touching mainland Scotland to the north and west, and then touching the northern part of Ireland, Rathlin Island, down into the Irish Sea. By the late 8th century, Ireland had been a Christian country for over 300 years and was home to many church settlements. These monasteries produced art objects and stunning illuminated manuscripts. But Ireland was not simply a land of saints and scholars. It lay splintered into dozens of small kingdoms, ruled over by kings and petty kings. These rulers regularly fought among themselves and often took prisoners during these conflicts. For the Irish, violence and slavery were everyday facts of life. The main way that the landscape of Ireland differs now from the Viking Age is in terms of forest cover. Ireland was thickly forested in large areas during the Viking Age. The landscape would have been less passable than it is nowadays because there would have been tracks and forest and bogland to negotiate. For the Vikings, the sea was not a barrier, that was a route. Many monasteries were located around the coast, on islands and promontories. Lying just off the Antrim coast, Rathlin is one of Ireland's most northerly islands. The abbot Congal founded a monastery there around 580 A.D. Living under strict rules of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a small community of monks flourished on the remote island for the next 2 centuries. But in 795, Viking longships headed southwards along Scotland's west coast in search of targets and booty. Rathlin and its monastery lay directly in their path. They would have performed a targeted raid fast out, taking as much loot and as many slaves as they could in a single trip. The attackers plundered the sacred shrine. Those who resisted were taken prisoner or killed. Then they set fire to the monastery. Traces of the Rathlin Vikings lay buried for over 1,000 years. In the 18th century, investigations uncovered a Viking cemetery on the island. And a few years ago, archaeologists made a fascinating discovery nearby. The find suggests that in their quest for riches, the Vikings called on supernatural powers. In 2018, the renovation of a house in Rathlin village uncovered the remains of a woman. Buried alongside was an ancient brooch. Its presence indicated that whoever this woman was, she died a very long time ago. In Belfast, archaeologist Stephen Gilmore carried out a post-excavation analysis of the remains. Once the archaeology was recovered, they cleaned the bones. She had lived a very hard life, and there was a great deal of evidence of wear and tear in her joints, evidence of degenerative joint disease, osteoarthritis, in her back, her kneecap, her hip joints, her hands, her neck. Basically, she would have lived in constant pain. Hoping to find out more about who she was, he sent a sample of the bone for DNA analysis. The Department of Genetics at Trinity College, Dublin, is at the forefront of modern genetic research. The researchers here specialize in ancient DNA, the process of extracting DNA from the bones of people who died long ago. DNA analysis can reveal surprising and even shocking information about individuals who lived many centuries ago. Doctoral researcher Emily Breslin is excited by what the Rathlin bones might reveal. The lady from Rathlin is a mystery. They have this lady who was buried on quite a remote island in the north of Ireland. She was quite advanced in years when she died, but she is from a very dynamic time period in which there was a lot of mobility. People were moving by the sea all over the north of Europe at the time. Extracting DNA from modern-day individuals is very, very easy. They can get DNA from blood tissues, even saliva. It is a completely different matter when dealing with archaeological remains. Much of this material will not yield any usable amount of human DNA. But there are some skeletal elements that are particularly good at preserving ancient DNA. What is called the petrous temporal bone, which surrounds the inner ear. Ancient bones are often in such bad condition that the survival of a petrous bone is by no means guaranteed. Luckily, the Rathlin remains yielded a usable sample. The team carried out the analysis and were surprised by the results. The genetic analysis confirmed that she was female and was estimated to have almost fully Norwegian-like ancestry, with no detectable trace of Irish or Scottish-like ancestry. She did not have the blonde hair and blue eyes, that stereotypical image of Vikings. She had dark brown hair, brown eyes, and a lighter skin tone. We all have the idea of the classic Viking with blonde hair and blue eyes, but we also see diversity. We have Vikings with darker pigmentation as well. The scientific analysis tells us a lot about the Rathlin woman. She was not native to the island, but grew up in Norway. But she is still cloaked in mystery. Who was she, and how did she come to die on a lonely island so far from home? Could she have been with the Vikings who raided Rathlin in 795 AD? She obviously was not a settler because there is no evidence of Viking settlement in Rathlin. You do not bring an old woman on a raid or trading mission without a very good reason. You want your ship filled with active horsemen, active warriors. Her role in a military mission, I think, is much more difficult to explain given her condition. Being part of a working team on a boat is not likely. And then, of course, you can look at other possibilities. The Vikings may have thought the woman could call on supernatural powers to aid their mission. Is there a possibility that she was their wise woman? You need somebody to protect you from the curses of the churches that you are knocking over. Maybe this was this woman's role. Magic seems to be associated with female characters. The female sphere in the Viking Age, in the written sources. And this actually has a parallel in Greek mythology and many other mythologies, that the household magic is a female sphere, what we call magic and sorcery, what they probably would call part of the living world, also has something to do with war. This is our modern way of understanding this phenomenon, because magic was probably as real to them as electrical objects are for us today. Whether or not they believed they had supernatural assistance, the Vikings continued to raid monasteries with deadly efficiency. In 807, they burned the church settlement on Inishmurray off Ireland's west coast. It seems the same raiders then continued down the coast in search of further prey. Located near Galway in Western Ireland, the peninsula of Roscommon looks southwest towards the Atlantic. Roscommon is best known for its medieval monastery, probably founded around the 7th century. All that survives are the remains of a small church, a graveyard, and a round tower. Today this seems like a remote rural area, but during Viking times, it was a major hub of European trade, so much so that it has attracted a research team from the University of Minnesota. Researchers Steve Matthews and David Woodward believe that before many European cities existed, Roscommon was an important international center. They use remote sensing technology to find out more. It works by shooting a pulse into the ground. It refracts back disturbances in the ground. What they are looking for are refractions that show human habitation or human activity. Right angles, square, features, longer features that would not necessarily be a geological feature. The data suggests this open field was once crowded with buildings, most likely workshop areas. They know that they were working a lot of iron here. They are looking at ironworks and forges. They were milling grain here. They were doing leather work. Monasteries really operated as a craft center for the local area. Roscommon would have been a center of industry and trade where all sorts of goods circulated, and a tempting target for the Viking raiders. It is hard to know what the Vikings knew about Roscommon before they came. It may have been a target of opportunity, but the site certainly was connected with much larger trade routes in the Atlantic, the trade routes, which we know were begun in the Bronze Age with the Phoenicians that stretched from North Africa, Egypt, up the coast of Spain, all the way here to Galway Bay, north to Scotland. These trade routes would have been known to the monks at the time, and if the Vikings did not know where they were coming at the time of Roscommon interviews with monks, would tell them exactly where the monasteries were. When we think of Ireland today, we think of it as a land. When you lived here in the 6th, 7th, 8th century, you thought of it as a gateway to the water. The water is the highway to the world. The Vikings understood this. The Irish understood this. What this says to me is that the Vikings knew and understood there was a rich monastery here at Roscommon at the time they hit it. The medieval Irish annals are year-by-year records of important events written down by monks. An entry for 807 A.D. chronicles the attack on Roscommon. The heathens invaded Roscommon. The moon was turned to the color of blood. The moon turning to blood is often interpreted as an eclipse, but that is our own modern thinking. We think, okay, a blood moon means an eclipse. A blood moon just means the moon is red as blood, and that can happen from a very Viking-oriented cause fire. When you burn things, especially on a massive scale, the moon turns bright red as if it is washed with blood. I would like to rethink our understanding of monks. Monks at the time are not cowards. They are very brave. Blood is the symbol of martyrs, and that goes all the way back to the very early church. Tertullian, the church father, said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." Vikings won battles with nasty weapons and a vicious attitude. Monks believed they would always win the war by outlasting it. Even so, the Viking raids had a devastating impact both physically and psychologically. People lived in fear of the threat that lurked on the sea. Wherever the Vikings struck, the only trail they left was the blood washed out with the tide. The quick-fire raids continued for decades. The Vikings carried off their booty and returned home. But from around 840 onwards, they started to establish more permanent settlements. To the Vikings, the sea was everything. It was their highway, a means to travel, to raid, and to trade. So, when they decided to set up permanent bases, it made sense to use sites on the coast and on rivers. These settlements grew into towns, something that has been quite revolutionary in archaeology over the last 20 years, is an understanding about how big some of these early Viking camps were. Excavations at sites like Woodstown, Dublin, Repton, Torksey have shown that these were very large settlements, so they were almost town-like, and you had lots of affiliated industries, people repairing stuff, people doing textiles, people doing metalwork and trading. Dublin was very important and very attractive as a proposition to gain a foothold because it sat on a river that went inland deep in England. But also, it is located between two Irish kingdoms, Beath and Leinster. So it was a border area where there was a bit of natural friction, military friction. And they capitalized on that. They were superb opportunists. Dublin became one of Europe's most important Viking towns. When the Vikings arrived, their many native Irish people were already living in the area. So they used force of arms to gain a foothold. But they still had need of the local population. So the Vikings came and were attracted to Dublin, not just by the loot, but they needed roads, and they needed access to fields, and they needed foodstuffs. Well, they had to have interaction with the hinterland and the Irish. They must have been trading with them, or they would not have survived. So the population at Dublin was not massacred or disposed of in any way. They were literally conquered. The Vikings who settled in Dublin may have managed to subdue the local Irish, but they quickly faced a critical threat to their power. Around 850, a new contingent of Scandinavians headed for Ireland. The Irish called them the Dark Foreigners. When this group emerged, they were in conflict with other bands of Vikings that were in Ireland. One group was called the Dark Foreigners, and one group was called the Fair Foreigners, using the terms dark and fair in other contexts in Irish language. They can sometimes mean new and old. The idea of maybe older being fairer, more eminent, and newer than having slightly negative connotations. The new or dark foreigners were led by two formidable Viking kings, Ivar and Olaf the White. They seemed like a different breed, more ambitious and ruthless than the fair foreigners, and soon they showed their predecessors who was in control. The dark heathens came to Dublin. They made a great slaughter of the fair foreigners and plundered the naval encampment, both people and property. Ivar and Olaf were now in command of the Dublin settlement and its extensive harbor. They had come with big ambitions. With routes by sea to Britain and Europe, Dublin was perfectly positioned for international trade. Its principal commodity was neither food nor precious items, but human flesh. The Norse did not introduce slavery to Ireland. Slaves were very much a presence within Irish society prior to the arrival of the Norse. What the Norse saw was an opportunity to profit from the slave trade because they had the ship technology that could bring them further afield and export these slaves further afield for a higher profit. Slavery was an accepted part of Gaelic life. The difference is that the Viking mentality was, I could almost say, practically nihilistic, but it was also eternally optimistic. They lived for the moment. So, to them, if you could fight on your 2 feet, and you did not want to be a slave, and you fought back well, good power to your elbow. But if you could not withstand them, then you were fair game. Olaf gathered many captives during the raids. They also traded with Irish kings who sometimes handed over prisoners in return for Viking silver. The Viking kings planned to make Dublin the slave-trading capital of Europe, and to realize this, they equipped and maintained large numbers of warriors. Archaeologists have uncovered the truth about this forgotten army, buried beneath this quiet parkland at Island Bridge. In Dublin, the National War Memorial Gardens are a calm and poignant place. The site commemorates thousands of men and women who gave their lives in the First World War. But this place is also connected with another army, one from much longer ago. During the 19th century, railway construction work nearby unearthed human remains from 1,000 years earlier. Island Bridge was home to a great Viking cemetery. Archaeologists Maeve Sikora and Bara O'Donoghue believe it to be one of the most important anywhere in Europe. The Liffey is on their left, and then they have the ridge that the town was built on, running on the right, and the railway came in between these. It did, and that is really the reason that all of these discoveries happened. It was a massive amount of industrial activity. Kilmainham Island Bridge is a massively important Viking concentration of Viking burials, and it is the largest west of Norway. Some of the graves belong to women, but most belong to young males fighting men, buried with their weapons. So, what is remarkable about Island Bridge and Kilmainham is the number of swords that were found, which is indicative of a warrior elite that were operating in Dublin at this time. Work on the War Memorial Gardens during the 1930s revealed more remains. 5 other Viking skeletons were discovered, and one of these is an incredibly well-preserved skeleton, and again, one of the few complete skeletons that survive. He was about 187 meters tall, so a very, very tall, strong individual, and he was discovered again with his weapons. The entire grave was blacklifted and brought into the National Museum for excavation. In the museum, the most recent discovery turned up outside this small gate lodge at the edge of the park. During the 2000s, a contractor laying cables here unearthed a sword and part of a spear. Further investigation revealed human bones. And the really unfortunate thing about the 19th century discoveries was that the human remains were not curated. So this was obviously very exciting to think that something might still remain. It may be the last remaining trace of in situ Viking burials in this part of Dublin. Modern technology allowed for a scientific investigation of the remains. This individual died between about 18 and 20 years of age, so he was a young man. Isotope analysis done on a tooth indicates that this individual did not grow up in Ireland. He was probably born somewhere like Scandinavia and moved to Dublin in his later life. So this Viking sword from Island Bridge is thought to date to the 9th century AD, and this is known because it has been compared with other examples that were found in Norway. So it is a Scandinavian weapon, and it was the weapon of a warrior. This young man had status. He may have been the son of a Viking lord or king. Like the other warriors whose graves lie deep in Island Bridge, he was buried in the late 9th century, around the time when Ivar and Olaf ruled Dublin. Dublin's Viking kings equipped and maintained this powerful army. But why? As pragmatic as they were ruthless, Ivar and Olaf knew that conquering Ireland would be difficult. The range of different power groups made it next to impossible for the Vikings to occupy the country. Easier conquests could be made elsewhere. The Viking kings looked to the land that lay eastwards across the grey swells of the Irish Sea. In 865 AD, Ivar embarked at the head of a force of Dublin Vikings. They journeyed to the east coast of England, where they joined up with other Viking bands. These warriors were united by a common goal to conquer England. They are known as the Viking Great Army. They were intent on conquest. Ivar is remembered both in history and in legend, being a prominent leader within the Viking Great Army. He can be seen moving between both islands for the purpose of political campaigns. The Vikings moved into Northumbria with two local kings locked in a bitter civil war. The region was in disarray. Taking advantage of the chaos, the Viking army captured the region's main city, York. Faced with a common enemy, the rival kings put aside their differences and tried to recapture York, but the invaders defeated and killed them. For decades to come, York would be a Viking city. The Vikings then headed for Whitby Abbey on the North Sea coast. These Gothic ruins date from the 13th century, but hundreds of years earlier, an even older monastery stood here. A Viking war band led by Ivar himself attacked and ransacked the place. Soon afterwards, it stood abandoned and empty. In the late 860s, the Viking army invaded the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south, laying waste to large parts of the country. This was a clear change of strategy for Ivar and the other Viking leaders. Instead of making quick smash and grab raids, They now focused on conquering large tracts of territory. Ivar's campaign in Britain succeeded beyond his wildest hopes. At York, he established a new base, a counterpart to the Viking kingdom of Dublin. We sometimes have stereotypes of Vikings as meatheads who did not really plan things out. But to organize such a successful political kingdom that stretched across the Irish Sea, that required a huge amount of planning. Ivar and Olaf had also gathered a huge supply of the most lucrative commodity in the Viking world. In 871, the Annals recorded a dramatic event. Olaf and Ivar returned to Dublin with 200 ships, bringing with them in captivity to Ireland a great prey of Angles, Britons, and Picts. In all, there must have been thousands of prisoners. For the Vikings, these captives were an extremely valuable commodity. They became part of a slave-trading empire stretching from Ireland to Scandinavia and the distant reaches of Europe. Ivar died in 873. By then his reputation was such that the annals called him King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. By the time of his death, he controlled most of the Irish seaboard region, from the Orkneys, the Western Isles, Argyll, Strathclyde, Caithness, the Isle of Man, and of course Dublin and York. It is a massive, vast area of territory that one man carved out in his lifetime. The empire being credible, in some ways, they certainly crossed boundaries, and we are talking about pan-maritime kingdoms here. Ivar's descendants now took up the mantle of Viking power and ambition. One after another, his sons and grandsons succeeded him as kings of Dublin. Territories controlled by Irish kings surrounded Dublin and Ireland's other Viking settlements. In the years after Ivar's death, they and the dark foreigners stayed locked in a delicate balance of power. Neither side could dominate the other, but the Vikings needed a steady supply of captives for the slave trade, so they continued raiding, attacking settlements and monasteries that lay under the protection of the Irish kings. Just north of Dublin stood the Irish kingdom of Brega, centered around the ancient passage tomb of Noth. The Vikings had attacked and plundered the site in the past, and in 896 A.D. they killed Flannacan mac Tillaig, the king of Brega. For Flannacan's kinsfolk, this was a point of no return, and in time they would avenge their slain king. In 902, the men of Brega joined forces with the kingdom of Leinster and struck at Dublin. It seems the two-pronged Irish attack caught the Vikings off guard. They were at the height of their power. They had already won great victories in Britain and Ireland. So to overturn that would have required quite a lot of planning and good luck to achieve that victory. The heathens were driven from the fortress of Dublin, and they abandoned a good number of their ships and escaped half dead after they had been wounded and broken. By now, all of Ivar's sons were dead. Several of his grandsons survived the attack and fled to Britain and France. The Dublin Vikings had suffered a devastating setback, but this was far from the end of the dynasty of Ivar. In the decades that followed, Ivar's descendants would recover their fortunes and wage war once again. And the greatest battle they fought would decide the fate of England. All the evidence suggests that there were thousands of people who participated in the battle. There was a huge gathering of military power by the standards of the time. Where the battle was fought will be where the birth of the nation of England happened.